Hi, my name is David Andolfatto. I'm with the Research Division at the St. Louis Fed. I'm here at the first annual St. Louis Advances in Economic Theory Conference. This afternoon I'm joined with Alexander Bick of Arizona State University, who presented a paper with the title, How Do Average Hours Work Vary with Development? Cross-Country Evidence and Implications. Thank you very much for being here, Alex.
Thank
to
you.
talk about your paper. So tell us what your paper's about.
So in our paper, we try to measure how hours worked on the aggregate level vary with development. That is basically how much do people in poor countries work and how much do people in rich countries work. Do they work more or do they work less? And the way we approach this question is by putting together data sets, household survey data sets from 81 countries in the early 2000s, try to measure hours work consistently across those countries and to have a comparable measure of these labor inputs.
So you, just from what you said, suggests that, we've had measurements of hours worked across countries before, but what you're trying to do is develop, improve on these measurements in some manner?
Exactly. So we have data from the OECD,
Okay.
from the total economy database for hours worked, mostly for countries that are today rich, but used to be poorer in the past, so starting from, let's say, the 1950s onwards. But these data measures to a large degree are problematic because the data sources that they're using are sometimes coming from employer surveys, sometimes from household surveys. So you're not measuring hours in a consistent way. The questions vary, the timing of those surveys within a year varies, which might be important for some of the European countries where we have long holidays, long vacation days. If you do an interview in August, you might not catch a lot of people that are actually working because they're all at the beach enjoying their lives. So you want to have surveys that cover the entire year to be representative of how much people actually work in a year. And I think we make a major improvement by putting together those data sets from various countries.
So when you approached this project, did you have in mind that these potential errors could be large, or you had no idea, or this is an exercise in let's just try to get a consistent data set together and see what it says?
So initially we had no idea. Initially how we started out is that we wanted to have data for not only for the aggregate but for specific demographic subgroups, let's say married couples.
Right.
Okay? And these data are not available by the OECD or anyone.
Okay.
So that's how we got going into the microdata. And in that process we learned that there are some issues with the comparability of these data that are on the aggregate level available. And that's how we expanded our data set from going from a smaller set of countries to a larger set of countries and also looking at the aggregate.
Okay, so it sounds like you did a lot of work.
Oh, yeah,
So
absolutely.
tell me, what did you find, and how does our understanding change from the data that we had before?
So mostly people had not even used those hours data from the other data sources, but focused on employment numbers. So basically we know that in poorer countries more people are working than in richer countries. I mean, they don't have social security, they don't go as long to school. So we knew that there are high employment rates, and that's usually how we measured labor inputs into aggregate production. And now looking at the hours, take into account how much people are working within a given week or over the year. I mean, if you look at, for example, measures of labor productivity, that is GDP per worker, in the sample of poor countries that we have, they are roughly, on the rich countries, the labor productivity is larger by a factor of 16. But if you take into account our new data on hours worked, which tell us that people in poor countries are also working longer hours, not only more of them are working, but they're working longer hours, the productivity differences increase by a factor of 19, which is a difference of 20%. So labor productivity differences are even starker than what we used to think based on the old measurement.
Right. Wow. So, in terms of, do you think that these findings would feed into the policy debate in some manner? How do you see your work feeding into the policy debate?
So one big question of macroeconomics is to understand, why are poor countries poor? Why don't they catch up more to the rich countries? And people are trying to investigate those differences and trying to find factors like human capital, financial institutions, rule of law, in order to investigate what can drive these dramatic differences that we cannot explain only alone with differences in capital or technologies. So our result is that, guys, you got to look even for bigger differences.
Yeah,
okay, we have to explain bigger differences why these countries are poor and have such low productivity. So I think that can stimulate more research, but it makes it even more challenging to understand why these poor countries are so poor.
Yeah, so we already knew that disparities were huge. Your results just point to that they're even larger,
Yes.
differences in international productivity, and therefore the answers to these policy questions are even more pressing.
Exactly, yes.
And if I understood correctly, a lot of what we knew about international differences and say how people choose the labor supply was based largely on body counts.
Exactly, yes.
Your expanded and more consistent data set had a more accurate measurement of hours, and in particular hours worked.
Yes.
So people, you mentioned we know people in lesser developed countries, more people are working because they don't go to school as much, et cetera. And in terms of how long they work, in terms of hours worked, how does that differ across developed and developing countries?
So if you look at weekly hours worked,
Yeah.
we talk about a difference of roughly 40 hours versus 35 hours on average in high-income countries.
Okay. And are there significant differences, say, between demographic characteristics across developed world, underdeveloped world, and, say, female labor supplies?
No, so that is actually very consistent across different
Is that right?
groups. So, for example, women are working fewer hours both in high-income countries and in low-income countries compared to men. But if you look at the difference between women in low-income countries and high-income countries, that is very similar to the difference between men in high-income countries and men in low-income countries.
Interesting.
The same is for education. If you look at age, we might be worried that all these aggregate differences that I was alluding to would be driven by just a different age composition, the fact that there are much less old people in developing countries, many more young kids. But if we kind of do that recalculation by reweighting things with the US weights, like calculating hypothetical hours, none of our results changes.
Wow. So, like I said, this sounds like a tremendous amount of work. I think you're doing a great public service. Where is this data available that you're constructing? Can we access it? Can the public access it?
It will be soon accessible.
Okay,
We will definitely make everything publicly available. All the data sets per se are available, so we're going to publish all our code, and people should have access to this data, absolutely.
Arizona State University, we'll look for you, departmental web pages. Free data, lots of it, really good. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you very much.